The wind did not just blow across the high plains of the Wyoming Territory. It scoured them. It was a living, breathing thing, possessing a malice that sought to strip the paint from the wood and the hope from the soul. It was late autumn in the year 1887, and the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of a winter that would be long and unforgiving. Hannah McCree stood by the side of the house, her mouth full of wooden clothespins, wrestling a wet sheet onto the line. The fabric snapped and cracked like a whip in the gale, fighting her grip. Her hands were raw, the knuckles swollen and red from the freezing water of the wash basin and the biting air. She did not wear gloves. Gloves made the pins clumsy, and Thomas did not like it when the laundry blew halfway to the county line because it had not been secured properly. She pinned the corner down and stepped back, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her dress, once a cheerful blue calico, had faded to the color of the dust that coated everything on the ranch. She pushed a stray lock of hair back behind her ear. She kept her hair pinned up tight, severe and practical. There was no vanity in it, only the necessity of keeping it out of the way of the churn, the stove, and the wind. From where she stood, the world looked like an ocean of brown grass, stretching out endlessly until it smashed against the base of the distant mountains. Those peaks were blue and jagged, capped with eternal snow. Sometimes, when the light hit them just right in the morning, they looked like the walls of a cathedral. Today, they looked like the bars of a cell. The ranch yard itself was a testament to a hard life. The barn sagged on its western side, looking like a tired beast kneeling down to die. The split rail fence that penned in the near pasture was gray and splintered, patching holes with whatever scrap wood could be found. The ground was a patchwork of frozen mud and dead weeds. In the distance, the cattle lowed, a mournful sound that carried for miles in the thin air. Hannah picked up the empty willow basket and turned back toward the house. It was a small structure, unpainted timber that had weathered to silver gray. It held the heat in the summer and the cold in the winter. It was the house Thomas had brought her to 5 years ago, promising her security. The sound of wagon wheels grinding against gravel reached her ears before the wagon itself crested the rise. Hannah paused, her hand gripping the rough handle of the basket. Her stomach tightened, a reflex she had learned to hide behind a mask of indifference. Thomas was home. The wagon lurched into the yard, pulled by 2 bays that looked as sour and tired as their driver. Thomas McCree sat hunched on the bench, his hat pulled low. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had been hardened by sun and whiskey in equal measure. He pulled the horses up with a heavy hand, the reins snapping. Hannah set the basket on the porch and waited. It was her duty to wait. Thomas climbed down, stumbling slightly as his boot hit the frozen earth. The smell of him reached her before he did, stale tobacco, horse sweat, and the sharp, sweet reek of cheap rye whiskey. He did not look at her. He began unhitching the team, his movements jerky and angry. "Damn thieves," he muttered, tossing a harness onto the ground. "Every last one of them in town." Hannah stepped off the porch. "I can take the horses, Thomas." He looked at her then, his eyes bloodshot and narrowed. "You go inside and get supper on. I do not need a woman doing my work. I've had enough of incompetence for one day." She nodded, keeping her eyes on the middle button of his coat. "Yes, Thomas." She went inside, the warmth of the stove offering little comfort against the chill he had brought with him. She moved efficiently, peeling potatoes and slicing the last of the salt pork. The kitchen was clean, scrubbed within an inch of its life. It was the only thing she had control over, so she ruled it with a desperate precision. When Thomas finally came in, stomping the mud from his boots onto the floor she had just swept, he was still muttering. He hung his heavy coat on the peg and slumped into the chair at the head of the table. $30 for seed, he said to the room, or perhaps to the ceiling. $30. And the railroad fees? Robbery. They squeeze a man until he is dry, and then they complain he has no blood left to give. Hannah set the plate before him. The stew steamed, thick and brown. "Did you manage to get the supplies for the winter?" she asked softly. He picked up his spoon and glared at the stew. I got what we could afford. Which is not much, seeing as the beef prices are in the cellar again because of those fat politicians in Washington. Men who do not know real work. Men who have never had to dig a post hole in frozen ground. He took a bite, chewed, and then stopped. He looked at her, his jaw working slowly. Hannah held her breath. Salt, he said, the word dropping like a stone. I put in what the recipe called for, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He dropped the spoon into the bowl. It clattered loudly in the small room. You are trying to dry me out from the inside? Woman, I work all day in the wind. My throat parched, and I come home to a bowl of brine? I am sorry. Thomas, I will add water. She reached for the bowl, but his hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. His fingers were like iron bands, cold and calloused. You are sorry, he mimicked, his voice dropping to a low growl. You are always sorry, Hannah. But sorry does not fix the fence, and sorry does not put money in the bank, and sorry does not make this stew fit for a dog. He released her wrist with a shove. She stumbled back a step, catching herself on the edge of the stove. I took you in, didn't I? He said, leaning back in his chair and picking up a piece of bread. When your father died and left you with nothing but a Bible and a debt, who stepped up? Who gave you a roof? You did. Thomas, that is right. I did. Most men would not have looked twice at a skinny preacher's daughter with no dowry and no skills. You remember that. Hannah, you remember that when you are salting the stew. I will remember, she said. She turned back to the stove to hide the trembling in her hands. She added water to the pot, stirred it, and brought him a fresh bowl. He ate in silence after that, the only sound the scraping of his spoon and the howling of the wind outside, which seemed to be trying to tear the house down board by board. That night, the darkness in the bedroom was total. The shutters were closed tight against the draft. Thomas lay on his back, snoring with a heavy, wet rattle that filled the small space. He took up the center of the bed. His limbs sprawled out, claiming the territory even in sleep. Hannah lay on the very edge of the mattress, her body stiff and straight. If she moved, the straw ticking would rustle, and he might wake. So she lay still, staring up at where she knew the ceiling was. The wind battered the wooden walls, a relentless assault. It sounded like voices, sometimes like people screaming or crying out on the prairie. She felt a physical ache in the center of her chest, a hollowness that felt as vast as the land outside. It was not just fear of Thomas, though that was always there. A cold knot in her stomach. It was a starvation. She was 24 years old, and she felt as ancient as the mountains. She was a tool to be used, a possession to be kept, a creature that existed only to serve the needs of the ranch and the man who owned it. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine a different life, a life where she could speak and be heard, a life where she was seen, really seen, not just as a pair of hands to wash clothes or a body to warm a bed, but as Hannah. But the image was faint and blurry, washed away by the reality of the snoring man beside her and the wind that promised nothing but snow. The next day dawned pale and cold. The sun was a white disk behind a veil of high, thin clouds. Hannah was on the porch, shaking out a rug. When she saw the rider, he was a speck at first, emerging from the heat shimmer and dust of the southern road. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. He rode a tall sorrel gelding that looked travel-worn but well cared for. He sat the saddle with the easy grace of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on his feet. He turned the horse into the yard and pulled up near the watering trough. The dogs, usually quick to bark, merely watched him, sensing a calmness in the stranger that silenced them. Hannah stood frozen, the rug forgotten in her hands. The man swung down from the saddle. He was lean, built like a whipcord, with broad shoulders that tapered to a narrow waist. His clothes were worn, canvas pants tucked into scarred boots, a heavy sheepskin coat that had seen better years, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He patted the neck of his horse and then turned toward the house. He saw Hannah and stopped. He reached up and removed his hat. His hair was dark, matted down from the brim, and his face was the color of old saddle leather. burned by the sun and wind. A faint white scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his collar, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a piercing gray, like the sky before a storm, and they scanned the horizon, the barn, and the fence line before settling on her. "Morning, ma'am," he said. His voice was gravelly and low, quiet enough that the wind almost stole it. "Good morning," Hannah replied, surprised by her own voice. Thomas came out of the barn then, carrying a pitchfork. He stopped when he saw the stranger, his posture shifting instantly into aggression. He gripped the pitchfork tighter and walked forward, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen mud. "Who are you?" Thomas barked, stopping 10 feet from the man. The cowboy turned slowly to face Thomas. He held his hat in his hands, but he did not hunch his shoulders. He stood tall. "Name is Cole Hart. What do you want?" "Hart." "Looking for work," Cole said simply. "And a place to lay my head before the snow flies." Thomas scoffed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near Cole's boot. Cole did not flinch. "Work?" Thomas said. "The season is over. I am not running a charity for drifters." "I am no charity case," Cole said. "I can ride, rope, and fix anything that is broken. I will work for my keep and fair wages." Thomas narrowed his eyes, looking Cole up and down, assessing him like he would a horse at an auction. "Where did you ride in from?" "South," Cole said. "Worked the Barquet down in Colorado territory for 2 seasons. Why did you leave?" "A man does not leave a steady job right before winter unless he is running from the law or he got run off." Cole's jaw tightened. The scar on his face seemed to stand out more starkly against his skin. "There was a disagreement." "Disagreement?" Thomas laughed. "A harsh, barking sound. That usually means you stole something or you slept with the boss's wife." Cole's eyes grew colder. The owner thought it was good business to run the brand on calves that belonged to the neighbors, and he thought a whip was the right way to discipline a man who spoke up about it. I did not agree. Hannah, watching from the porch, felt a shiver go through her. It was rare to hear a man speak of justice in this country. Most men spoke of survival, or profit, or power. Thomas stared at Cole for a long moment. He did not like the answer. Hannah could tell. He did not like men who thought for themselves. But he also looked at the fence that needed mending, and the barn roof that was leaking, and the winter feed that needed hauling. "I cannot pay top dollar," Thomas said gruffly, "and I do not tolerate insubordination. You do what I say. When I say it, you sleep in the bunkhouse. It is cold, but it is dry. That will suffice." Cole said, "And you work until the job is done. I do not care if it is dark or if it is snowing." "I am not afraid of work," Thomas grunted. "All right then, but I am watching you. Hart, you give me one reason, one sideways look, and you will be walking to Cheyenne in a blizzard. Do you understand?" "I understand. Put your horse up." "Then get the wire stretchers and the post digger. The north section of the fence is down, the section bordering the creek. That is 3 miles out," Cole noted, glancing at the position of the sun. "Then you best get started," Thomas said, turning his back and walking toward the house. Cole watched him go, then looked back at the porch. He met Hannah's eyes again. He nodded, a slow, respectful dip of his chin, before putting his hat back on and leading his horse toward the barn. Hannah watched him go. He did not look at her like she was a ghost, or a servant, or a piece of furniture. He had looked at her like she was a person standing there. She folded her hands in her apron, her heart beating a strange, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the waning sun and the encroaching winter. Thomas was a hard master. He sent Cole out before dawn and expected him to work until the light was gone. He gave him the worst horses to ride and the heaviest tasks. He seemed to be testing the cowboy, waiting for him to break or to lash out. But Cole did not break. He worked with a steady, quiet efficiency. He repaired the corral gate that had hung crooked for 2 years. He cleared the irrigation ditch of tumbleweeds and silt, and he rode out every day to the North Ridge, fixing the fence line that Thomas was so obsessed with. Hannah and Cole crossed paths only in the spaces between the work. On the third morning, Hannah carried a pot of coffee out to the corral where Cole was saddling a nervous roan mare. The air was frigid, her breath puffing out in white clouds. "Mr. Hart," she said, standing by the rails. Cole turned, the cinch strap in his hand. He dropped it and walked over to the fence. "Morning, Mrs. McCree. I brought some coffee. It is fresh. Thank you, ma'am." He reached through the rails and took the tin cup. His fingers were thick and calloused, stained with grease and dirt, but he was careful not to touch her hand. He took a sip and sighed. The steam rising around his face, that saves a man's life on a morning like this. She watched him drink. "Is the bunkhouse warm enough? There are extra blankets in the chest if you need them." "It is fine. Ma'am, I have slept in snowdrifts warmer than some hotels I have been in. This is luxury." She smiled. A small, tentative thing. It felt strange to smile. She was not sure she remembered how to do it properly. Later that week, she found him at the pump, washing his hand. The water running into the trough was pink. "You are hurt," she said, setting down her bucket. Cole pulled his hand back quickly, hiding it against his side. "Just a scratch. Ma'am, barbed wire. It has a mind of its own sometimes." "Let me see. It is nothing. Mr. Hart, please. Infection sets in quick out here." He hesitated, then slowly held out his hand. A jagged tear ran across the back of his knuckles, deep and angry. Blood welled up and dripped onto the frozen ground. Hannah reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a clean strip of cloth she kept for such things. "Hold still." She took his hand in hers. His skin was rough, like sandpaper, warm and hard. Her own hands, cracked from the cold, looked small and pale against his. She poured a little water from the dipper over the cut to clean it, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. "Sorry," she whispered. "It is fine," he said, his voice tight. She wrapped the cloth around his hand, binding it firmly. She could feel the strength in his hand, the latent power, yet he held it perfectly still for her. For a moment, as she tied the knot, her fingers brushed the inside of his wrist. She felt the steady, heavy thrum of his pulse. She looked up, and he was looking down at her. His eyes were dark, guarded, but there was a heat in them that had nothing to do with the sun. The wind howled around the corner of the barn, whipping her skirt and his coat, but in that small space between them, the air felt suddenly still and heavy. "There," she said, stepping back quickly, her face flushing hot despite the cold. "Keep it clean. Thank you. Mrs. McCree," he said softly. She picked up her bucket and hurried back to the house, her heart hammering in her ears like a trapped bird. The landscape seemed to amplify everything. The vastness of the prairie, the endless gray sky, the towering silence. It all served to make every human connection feel fragile and precious. When Hannah hauled water from the well, the wind biting through her wool shawl, she felt small and insignificant against the scale of the world. But then she would look up and see Cole riding along the ridge, a silhouette against the snow clouds building in the north, and she would feel a strange tether connecting them. They were two warm specks of life in a world of cold indifference. Evenings were the hardest. The sun would drop behind the mountains, plunging the world into a purple twilight, and they would retreat into the house. Cole ate with them at the table, a condition of his employment, though Thomas made sure he sat at the far end. Thomas dominated the room. He liked to drink whiskey after supper, his face growing flush, his voice growing louder. He would lean back in his chair, picking his teeth, and tell stories that were meant to be lessons. "This land," Thomas said one night, gesturing with his glass toward the dark window. "It does not give anything away. You have to take it. You have to bleed for it." Cole ate his stew quietly, his eyes on his plate. "I remember when I first staked this claim," Thomas went on. "There were squatters, trash, people who thought that just because they parked a wagon, they owned the earth. There was a man, Miller, I think his name was, thought he could fence off the creek. Said he had papers." Thomas chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Papers do not stop a bullet, and papers do not stop a man who knows what is his. Hannah stiffened in her chair. She hated these stories. They were not just history, they were threats. "What happened to him?" Cole asked. He did not look up, but his spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Thomas took a long swallow of whiskey. He disappeared. Just like that. Wagon, horses, family, gone. The wind took them, I suppose. Or maybe he realized that some men are not meant to be crossed. He slammed the glass down on the table. "I defended this land. Heart, every inch of it. And I will keep defending it. Against the government, against the bank, and against any man who thinks he can take what is mine." He looked directly at Cole then, his eyes glazed and hard. "And that goes for everything on this ranch. The land, the cattle, and the people." Cole slowly raised his eyes. He met Thomas's stare with that same calm, terrifying steadiness. "A man has a right to defend what is his, McCree. But a man also has to know the difference between what he owns and what he just holds captive." The silence that followed was louder than the wind. Thomas's face turned a shade darker red. His hand twitched toward the knife on the table. Hannah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. "I will get the coffee," she said, her voice shrill. The tension broke, but it did not leave. It hung in the corners of the room, shadowing them. Thomas laughed, breaking the spell, but there was no humor in it. "You do that, woman. You get the coffee." As Hannah moved to the stove, she could feel Cole's eyes on her back. She could feel the weight of Thomas's threat. And outside, the wind picked up, screaming across the plains, bringing with it the scent of snow and the promise of a storm that would bury them all. Winter arrived not with a whimper, but with the heavy, suffocating silence of a shroud being drawn over the dead. The sky, which had threatened violence for days, finally made good on its promise in the first week of December. The clouds descended until they swallowed the peaks of the mountains, erasing the horizon and turning the world into a claustrophobic box of gray slate. Thomas McCree stood by the door, buttoning his heavy buffalo hide coat. He looked like a bear standing on its hind legs, massive and dark against the pale light filtering through the window. He checked the load in his revolver, spinning the cylinder with a practice that made Hannah flinch, though she was standing across the room kneading dough. "I will be gone 2 days, Thomas said, his voice flat. "Maybe 3 if the passes drifted over. I have business with the bank, and I intend to have a conversation with the grain merchant about his robbery of prices." Hannah wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "The storm is coming. Thomas, look at the sky. It is too heavy." He ignored her, pulling his hat down low over his brow. "I have ridden through worse than a little snow. Woman, you just mind the house. Keep the fire banked, and do not let the water butt freeze over." He turned his gaze toward the window where Cole Hart was visible in the yard, chopping wood with a rhythmic, tireless swing of the axe. "And tell Hart to keep the place running," Thomas added, his eyes narrowing. "I want the south fence line checked again before the drifts get too deep. If I come back and find cattle wandering the plains because he was too lazy to tighten a wire, I will take it out of his hide." He opened the door, and a gust of freezing wind rushed in, scattering the flour on the table and making the lantern flame dance wildly. "Stay put, Hannah," he commanded, looking back at her one last time. Then he was gone, the door slamming shut with a rattle that shook the iron skillet hanging on the wall. Hannah stood still for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of hooves crunching on the frozen earth, fading until there was only the wind. She was alone, or as alone as she ever was these days, with the silent, brooding presence of the cowboy inhabiting the edges of her life. By noon, the snow began. It started as small, hard pellets that hissed against the glass, but within an hour, it had transformed into thick, heavy flakes that fell straight down, relentless and blinding. By mid-afternoon, the wind rose up, a banshee scream that tore across the miles of open prairie, picking up the fallen snow and hurling it sideways until the air was white and impenetrable. Hannah moved through the house, checking the windows, stuffing rags into the cracks where the draft whistled through. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted. Even with the stove roaring, she felt a deep, primal unease. This was a killing storm. The kind of blizzard that swallowed herds and men alike, leaving nothing but frozen shapes to be found in the spring thaw. She was setting the table for a solitary supper, or a silent one with Cole. If he came in, when she heard it, a sound, faint but distinct over the howling wind, a high-pitched, desperate bleat. She froze, straining her ears. It came again, terrified and weak. Hannah grabbed her heavy wool shawl and wrapped it around her head and shoulders. Snatching the lantern from the hook, she pushed the door open and gasped as the cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind nearly knocked her backward. The world was gone. There was only swirling white darkness. The barn was a dark shape 20 yards away, but it felt like miles. She fought her way across the yard, her boots sinking into drifts that were already knee-deep. "Cole!" she screamed, her voice snatched away instantly by the gale. She saw the glow of a lantern near the corral fence. Cole was there, a dark figure struggling against the white chaos. He was waist-deep in a drift that had piled up against the split rails. Hannah pushed forward, shielding her face with her arm. As she got closer, she saw what was happening. A calf, separated from its mother, had gotten pinned against the fence by the drifting snow. It was buried up to its neck, its eyes rolling in panic, thrashing weakly. Cole was digging frantically with his gloved hands, trying to clear the space around the animal's chest. "Get back inside," Cole yelled when he saw her, his voice rough with exertion. "I can help," Hannah shouted back. She didn't wait for his permission. She threw herself into the snow beside him. The cold was shocking, seeping instantly through her skirts and petticoats. She grabbed the calf's hindquarters, her fingers slipping on the icy fur. "He is stuck on the bottom rail." Cole roared over the wind. "I have to lift him. You pull when I lift." Hannah nodded, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Cole moved, positioning himself between the fence and the calf. He grunted, a guttural sound of effort, and heaved upward. Hannah grabbed the calf's torso, burying her hands in its coat, and pulled with everything she had. For a moment, nothing moved. The snow held the animal like wet concrete. Then, with a lurch, the calf broke free. It scrambled, legs flailing, and tumbled onto the clearer ground of the yard. Cole stumbled back, losing his footing, and Hannah fell with him. For a second, they were a tangle of limbs in the snow, the wind screaming above them. Hannah felt the weight of his leg against hers, the solid, hard breadth of his shoulder knocking into her own. "Get to the barn!" Cole shouted, grabbing her arm and hauling her up. They scrambled toward the gaping maw of the barn doors, guiding the shivering calf between them. They practically fell inside, Cole heaving the heavy door shut against the wind and dropping the latch. The sudden silence was deafening. The roar of the storm was muffled to a dull, angry throb outside the timber walls. Inside, the air was still and smelled of hay, manure, and warm animal bodies. Hannah leaned back against a stall door, gasping for air. Her lungs burned from the cold. Beside her, Cole was bent over, hands on his knees, his breath coming in ragged clouds of steam. They stood there for a long time, just breathing. The lantern Cole had hung on a nail cast long, dancing shadows across the straw. "Are you all right?" Cole asked. Straightening up, he looked at her, really looked at her. His face was red from the wind, melted snow dripping from his eyelashes and the brim of his hat. "I think so," Hannah whispered. Her hands were trembling violently, adrenaline and cold warring in her veins. Cole took a step toward her. "You should not have come out. Hannah, you could have been lost in 5 feet of visibility. I heard the calf. She said I could not just leave it." He looked at the calf, which had wobbled over to a pile of hay and collapsed, exhausted. Then he looked back at her, the space between them, in the narrow aisle of the barn, felt suddenly incredibly small. Hannah realized how close they were standing. She could smell the wet wool of his coat, the scent of the snow that clung to him, and beneath it, The scent of the man himself, sweat and leather and tobacco. She saw the rise and fall of his chest. The steam of their breath mingled in the air between them, a visible connection that swirled and vanished. Hannah felt a pull in her chest, terrifying and undeniable. It was gravity. It was the sensation of falling while standing perfectly still. Cole's eyes dropped to her hands, which were clutching her shawl, red and raw. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he seemed to catch himself. He pulled his hand back and clenched it into a fist at his side. "You are freezing," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Go inside. Get by the fire. I will finish up here." Hannah nodded, unable to speak. She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing his arm. The contact sent a shock through her that was hotter than the stove. She fled the barn, running blindly back through the storm to the safety of the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. That night, the storm intensified. The house groaned under the assault. Timbers creaked and popped like gunshots. Hannah lay in bed, buried under 3 quilts, but she could not stop shivering. She was not shivering from the cold. She was shivering from the memory of Cole's eyes in the lantern light, the way the air had seemed to thicken around them. Sometime after midnight, a tremendous crash shook the house. Hannah sat bolt upright, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound had come from the kitchen. She grabbed the candle and ran into the main room. A blast of icy air and snow hit her face. A section of the roof, right over the pantry, had given way under the weight of the drifts. Shingles and splintered wood littered the floor, and snow was pouring in, along with a steady stream of meltwater from the heat of the house. Before she could even process the disaster, the back door flew open. Cole burst in, fully dressed, his coat thrown hastily over his flannel shirt. He carried a heavy timber post from the woodpile. "The beam is cracked," he shouted. "Seeing the sagging ceiling? Get the table." Hannah scrambled to help him. They dragged the heavy oak table across the floor, positioning it under the groaning roof beam. Water dripped onto them, freezing and dirty. "It is not enough," Cole grunted, looking up. "The crossbeam is splitting. I need to brace it with this post. Help me wedge it." He hoisted the heavy timber onto the table. He climbed up, his boots slipping on the wet surface. "Hold it steady," he ordered. Hannah climbed up beside him. She grabbed the rough wood of the post, her arms straining. Cole jammed the top of the post against the cracked ceiling beam. "Push," he gritted out. They pushed together, grunting with the effort. The wood groaned, resisted, and then finally snapped into place, taking the weight of the roof. Cole let out a breath, wiping water from his eyes. That will hold until morning. As he turned to climb down, his boots slipped on a patch of melting snow on the table surface. He lurched backward. Hannah reached out instinctively to catch him. Her hands grabbed his shirt front. At the same moment, Cole's hand shot out and clamped onto her waist to steady himself. They froze. They were standing on the table, the kitchen in chaos around them, snow swirling in through the hole in the roof. But Hannah was aware of only one thing: the heat of his hand on her waist. It burned through the fabric of her dress. She was pressed against him, her shoulder dug into his chest, her cheek inches from his collarbone. She could feel the rapid thud of his heart beneath her palm. It was beating as fast as hers. Time seemed to suspend. The wind howled, the house creaked. But in that circle of candlelight, there was only the two of them. Hannah looked up. Cole was staring down at her, his eyes wide and dark, his lips parted slightly. The look on his face was not fear of the storm. It was a naked, terrified hunger. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The urge to lean in, to close that tiny distance, was a physical ache in Hannah's chest. Then, the moment shattered. Hannah stepped back quickly, nearly tripping over her own skirts. Her face burned hot. "Thank you," she said, her voice unsteady and breathless. You saved the roof." Cole dropped his hand from her waist as if he had been burned. He cleared his throat, looking away toward the broken ceiling. "Just doing the job, ma'am." He climbed down from the table, his movements stiff. We will need to put a tarp over that hole from the outside as soon as the wind dies down. Put buckets under the leak for now." He did not look at her again. He turned and walked out into the storm, closing the door firmly behind him. Hannah stood in the ruined kitchen, listening to the drip, drip, drip of the water, her hand pressing against the spot on her waist where he had touched her. The next 2 days were a torture of silence. Thomas did not return. The drifts were too deep. The pass was surely closed. Hannah and Cole were trapped in the white isolation of the ranch. Cole began to avoid the house. He spent hours in the barn, finding chores that did not exist, mending harnesses that were not broken, but the cold and the necessity of food forced them together. Breakfasts were an exercise in agony. They sat at the small table, the gray light of the storm filtering through the windows. The only sounds were the clinking of forks on tin plates and the wind. Cole kept his eyes on his food. Hannah stared at her coffee cup. The air between them was thick, charged with the memory of the barn and the kitchen. Every time he reached for the salt, Hannah held her breath. Every time she poured him more coffee, she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. It was a second storm, raging inside the house, silent and invisible, but just as dangerous as the one outside. On the third evening, the wind finally died. The silence that followed was immense. The temperature dropped even further, freezing the world into a crystal stillness. Hannah looked out the window and saw Cole by the water trough. He was chipping away ice with a pry bar. He had no gloves on. He had likely soaked them and taken them off to work better. She watched him for a moment. The line of his back, the determined set of his shoulders. She made a decision, or perhaps the decision made itself. She poured a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. She took her own wool shawl from the hook, not the rough one she used for chores, but the softer one she saved for church. She walked out into the biting cold. The snow crunched loudly under her boots. Cole did not turn until she was right beside him. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow despite the freezing air. "Mrs. McCree," he said, his voice guarded. "I brought you coffee," she said, holding out the cup. "And I thought you might be cold." She held out the shawl. "It is an extra. You can use it while you work." Cole looked at the shawl, then at her. His gray eyes were tired. He took the coffee cup first, their fingers brushing against the tin handle. He didn't pull away this time. He let the contact linger for a fraction of a second too long. "Thank you, Hannah," he said. He had never used her given name before. The sound of it in his gravelly voice made her knees weak. He draped the shawl over his shoulders. It looked ridiculous on him, too small and feminine, but he pulled it tight as if it were armor. "Why do you stay out here so late?" Hannah asked softly. "The work can wait until morning." Cole took a sip of the coffee, looking out over the moonlit snow. "It is safer out here," he said quietly. "Safer from what?" He turned to look at her. "You know what?" Hannah, she did know. She looked down at her hands. "I used to dream of a library," she said suddenly. The words spilled out before she could check them. Cole frowned slightly. "A library? Back east, in Ohio. My father was a pastor, a very stern man. He believed books were vanity, unless it was the good book. But I used to sneak into the schoolhouse after hours just to smell the paper. I wanted to teach. I wanted to read stories to children who had never seen the ocean." She wrapped her arms around herself, looking at the frozen trough. But then Father died, and there were debts. And Thomas was coming west. He needed a wife. It was practical. Everyone said how lucky I was. A man with a land. A man with ambition. She gave a bitter, short laugh. "I thought I could bring my books, but Thomas burned them the first winter. Said they were clutter. Said a rancher's wife needs to know how to gut a chicken, not how to conjugate Latin verbs." She looked up at Cole, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Sometimes I feel like a ghost. Cole, like I'm haunting this house, wearing Hannah's clothes, doing Hannah's chores. But the real me." She disappeared somewhere between Ohio and Wyoming. Cole watched her, his expression softening into a profound sadness. He set the coffee cup down on the edge of the trough. "My father sold me. He said—" Hannah stared at him. Sold you? To a drover. I was 12. Dad had a gambling habit he could not feed and a debt he could not pay. The trail boss took me on as a cook's boy to settle the bill. Cole looked at his hands, turning them over to look at the calluses and scars. I cried for the first 100 miles. After that, I stopped. You learn quick on the trail. You learn that tears get you beaten, and weakness gets you killed. He looked out at the horizon. I have seen men trampled in stampedes until there was nothing left to bury. I have seen men shot over a game of cards or a patch of grass. I have drifted from Texas to Montana, Hannah, looking for, I do not know, a place that did not feel like a fight. He looked back at her. I am tired of drifting. I am tired of sleeping with one eye open, but I do not know how to stop. It is all I know. The silence between them now was not awkward. It was heavy with shared grief. They were two pieces of driftwood thrown up on the same rocky shore. You are not a ghost, Hannah, Cole said softly. He took a step closer to her. The steam of their breath mingled again in the moonlight. I see you, he whispered. I see you every time you hang the laundry. I see you when you look at the mountains like you want to fly over them. You are the most real thing in this God-forsaken territory. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to reach out. She wanted to touch the scar on his jaw. She wanted to step into the warmth of his coat and never come out, but before she could move, the sound of a horse snorting broke the stillness. They both spun around. Thomas was riding into the yard. His horse was chest deep in snow, exhausted and foaming. Thomas sat slumped in the saddle, swaying dangerously. He had made it back. Hannah felt a cold dread wash over her, extinguishing the warmth of the moment instantly. Thomas slid off the horse, falling to his knees in the snow before staggering up. He saw them standing by the trough. Well, well, he slurred, leading the horse toward them. Isn't this a pretty picture? He stopped a few feet away, swaying. The smell of whiskey was strong enough to water the eyes. Thomas, Hannah said, stepping forward. You made it through the pass. We were worried. Worried? Thomas sneered. He looked from Hannah to Cole, his eyes narrowing in the moonlight. You look real cozy to me. Standing out here in the dark, whispering. I was just fixing the trough, boss, Cole said, his voice flat and hard again. And Mrs. McCree brought me some coffee to keep the frostbite off. Coffee, Thomas mocked. He stepped up to Hannah, looming over her. He reached out and touched the shawl draped over Cole's shoulders. That is my wife's shawl. Heart. Cole took it off slowly and handed it to Hannah. Just borrowed it. McCree. Thomas grabbed Hannah's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. You are always whining about the cold. Hannah, but you seem warm enough now. Maybe you found another way to generate heat. Thomas, stop! Hannah gasped, trying to pull away. Thomas shoved her toward the house. Get inside, before I lose my temper. He turned to Cole. He took a step closer, until they were almost nose to nose. Cole did not back down. You listen to me. Drifter, Thomas hissed. I know your type. You think because I am gone, you can sniff around my property? I have done nothing but the work you paid me for, Cole said calmly. Thomas poked a finger into Cole's chest. Hands that touch what is mine don't last long in this country. Heart, you remember that, or you will end up like the last man who thought he could take a piece of my pie. He turned and dragged his horse toward the barn, leaving Cole standing alone in the snow. That night, the house was silent again, but it was a terrified silence. Thomas had passed out almost as soon as his boots were off, the whiskey pulling him into a dark stupor. Hannah lay awake beside him. She could feel the cold radiating from the wall, but her skin felt like it was on fire. She replayed the conversation by the trough over and over in her mind. I see you, he had said. You are the most real thing in this territory. She hated herself. She was a married woman. She had sworn vows before God and a congregation. To desire another man was a sin. It was a betrayal. But as she lay there, listening to Thomas's drunken snores and feeling the bruising grip of his fingers still ghosting on her arm, She could not make herself repent. She turned her head and looked at the window. Where the moonlight painted a square on the floor, she wanted him. She wanted Cole Hart with a fierceness that frightened her. She wanted his rough hands, his quiet voice, his understanding. She wanted to be seen, and God help her. She knew that the next time Thomas left, she might not have the strength to stay on her side of the line. The winter was long, and the fire between them was the only thing keeping the cold at bay. The blizzard had been a hammer, beating the world into submission. But the winter that followed was a knife. It was a season of sharp, blinding clarity. The storms passed, leaving behind a sky of such piercing blue that it hurt the eyes to look at it. The sun shone with a deceptive brilliance, bouncing off the endless white drifts. But it offered no warmth. The air was so cold it felt solid, burning the lungs with every inhale and freezing the moisture in the nose instantly. On the McCree Ranch, the world had been reduced to the basics of survival. The cattle stood knee-deep in frost, their breath pluming in thick clouds, their coats shaggy and matted with ice. They huddled in the lees of the ridges, dark shapes against the blinding white. Cole Hart rode the line every day. He wrapped his face in a wool scarf until only his eyes were visible, gray and narrowed against the glare. The work was brutal. Chopping ice from the watering holes took hours of back-breaking labor with a pry bar. Pitching hay from the stack to the hungry herd made his muscles burn and his sweat freeze against his skin. Hannah watched him from the window as she kneaded dough or scrubbed the floorboards. She watched the way he sat his horse, rigid against the wind yet moving in rhythm with the animal. She watched him beat his gloved hands against his thighs to get the blood moving. Their interactions inside the house had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. They passed each other with eyes downcast. They spoke only of practical things. The wood box is low, Cole might say, standing by the door, letting the cold air bleed off his coat. I will fetch more, Hannah would reply, reaching for her shawl. I will get it. He would cut in, his voice rough. You stay in the heat. It was a kindness, but it was also a barrier. It was his way of saying that he remembered the night in the barn, the moment on the table when his hand had rested on her waist, and that he was terrified of it happening again. But silence is a poor wall against the kind of fire that was smoldering between them. Every time their fingers brushed when passing a plate, every time he held the door for her, and she had to squeeze past him in the narrow frame, the air grew tighter. It was like the static charge before a lightning strike, invisible but raising the hair on the arms. In the middle of January, the isolation broke. The supply wagon was empty of flour and coffee, and Thomas decided the pass was clear enough to make the run to town. He ordered Cole to hitch the team to the sled, a heavy, flat-bottomed conveyance on iron runners. You are coming too, Hannah, Thomas said, looking at her over his morning coffee. You need to pick out cloth, and I want the town to see we are still alive. People talk when they do not see a woman for 3 months. They start to think I have buried you in the cellar. He laughed at his own joke. Hannah did not laugh. She put on her heaviest cloak and climbed into the sled, sitting on a pile of buffalo robes. Cole drove the team, while Thomas sat beside him, nursing a flask of whiskey against the cold. The town of Bitter Creek was not much to look at in the summer, just a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the muddy bank of the river. In the winter, it looked like a graveyard. Smoke rose straight up from the chimneys in thin gray pillars. The streets were packed hard with snow and horse manure. Thomas left them at the general store, heading straight for the saloon to talk business. Cole tied the team and helped Hannah down. He offered his hand, and for a moment, her gloved fingers rested in his. Through the thick wool and leather, she could still feel the strength of his grip. I will help you with the flour sacks, ma'am, he said, his eyes scanning the street. Hannah walked into the mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that seemed out of place. The store smelled of sawdust, spices, and kerosene warmth. Several women were gathered by the fabric counter, their heads bent together. When Hannah entered, the conversation stopped abruptly. Mrs. McCree, the shopkeeper's wife. Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was too loud, too bright. We did not expect to see you until the thaw. We ran low on supplies, Hannah said, moving toward the counter. The other women watched her. Their eyes were not friendly. They were curious, calculating. Hannah felt a flush rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. She could hear the whispers even when they were not speaking. I heard Thomas has expanded the fence line again, one woman murmured to another, pretending to inspect a bolt of blue gingham right over the creek. That is what I heard, the other replied, just like he did with the Miller place. Hannah stiffened. She kept her eyes on the jar of peppermint sticks on the counter. Is Mr. McCree with you? Mrs. Gable asked. He is at the saloon, Hannah said. And the hired man? He is loading the sled. The women exchanged glances. A hired man, a drifter, living under the same roof through the long, dark winter. Hannah could see the thoughts forming in their minds, the scandalous stories being written before they even happened. She felt small and dirty, though she had done nothing but survive. She made her purchases quickly: flour, sugar, coffee, a packet of needles. She did not buy the cloth Thomas had told her to get. She just wanted to leave. Outside, the air was crisp and biting. Cole was loading the 50-pound sacks of flour onto the sled with easy heaves. Down the street, the door to the hardware store banged open. Thomas McCree walked out, followed by Mr. Henderson, the owner. Thomas was loud, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. I told you, Henderson, I will pay the bill when I sell the herd in the spring, Thomas shouted. He poked the smaller man in the chest. You do not dictate terms to me. I have been in this valley since before you were sweeping floors. Mr. Henderson looked terrified. He held his hands up, backing away. I only meant, the credit is extended quite far. Mr. McCree, the bank is pressing me. Let them press, Thomas roared. If you cut me off, I will burn your reputation in this territory. I will make sure no rancher within 50 miles buys so much as a nail from you. Do you understand me? I understand. Thomas, please, there is no need for a scene. Cole had stopped loading the sled. He stood by the horses, one hand resting on the harness, watching. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He saw the way Henderson flinched when Thomas raised his hand. He saw the way the man swallowed his pride and looked at the ground, shamed and powerless. Cole looked at Hannah, who was standing by the sled, her face pale. He realized, with a sick feeling in his gut, that she wore the same expression as the shopkeeper. It was the look of a person who had learned that survival meant making oneself small. Thomas came striding toward them, his face flushed with victory and whiskey. Did you get the supplies? He barked at Hannah. Yes, Thomas. Good. Let's go. I am sick of this town, full of vultures and cowards. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The sun began to dip toward the mountains, turning the snow to a bruised purple. Thomas fell asleep, his head lolling against his chest. Hannah stared at the horizon, feeling the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Cole drove the horses, his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was raging. He had seen bullies before. He had seen men who used their size and their anger as a weapon. But seeing it directed at a shopkeeper was one thing. Knowing it was waiting for Hannah inside that house was another. The explosion came 3 nights later. Thomas had ridden out to check on a rumor he had heard in the saloon, that the Union Pacific was surveying a new spur line that would cut through the valley. He came back after dark, and he was in a black rage. The rumor, it turned out, was true. But the line was set to bypass the McCree land entirely. Crossing the river 5 miles south, it meant no buyout money. It meant no increase in land value. It meant he was just another rancher with too much land and too little cash. He stormed into the house, kicking the snow from his boots with violent force. He went straight for the bottle on the sideboard. Thieves, he muttered, pouring a glass with a shaking hand. Every damn one of them. They mapped the land to suit their friends. Hannah was at the stove, pouring coffee. The tension in the room was suffocating. She knew the signs. She knew the way his breathing changed, the way his movements became jerky and unpredictable. "Supper is ready." "Thomas," she said softly. He spun around, his eyes wild. "You think I care about supper? I'm talking about our future. Woman, I'm talking about ruin." He slammed his hand onto the table. The plates rattled. Cole was sitting in the corner, mending a bridle. He stopped working, his hands still, watching Thomas. Hannah's hand trembled as she brought the coffee pot to the table. The sudden noise of Thomas's fist made her jump. The pot clipped the edge of his cup. Brown liquid splashed over the rim and onto the white tablecloth. "You clumsy cow!" Thomas roared. "It happened so fast." Thomas stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. He backhanded the cup, sending it flying across the room where it shattered against the wall. Then he grabbed the back of the chair. With a grunt of rage, he lifted it and hurled it. It did not hit Hannah, but it smashed into the wall inches from her head, splintering a leg and sending wood fragments showering over her. Hannah cried out. Dropping the coffee pot, it clattered to the floor, spilling the rest of the hot liquid over her skirt and boots. She backed away, pressing herself into the corner by the stove, her arms raised to protect her face. Thomas took a step toward her, his hand raised, his face twisted into a mask of pure violence. "You are useless, a burden. I should have left you to rot in Ohio. Enough!" The word cracked through the room like a whip. Cole was there. He had moved with a speed that belied his calm demeanor. He stepped between Thomas and Hannah, planting his boots firmly on the floorboards. He did not raise his hands, but his posture was a barricade. "Get out of my way." "Hart," Thomas snarled. "This is none of your business." "You are not going to hit her," Cole said. His voice was not loud, but it was deadly level. Thomas blinked, stunned that the hired hand was defying him. He looked at Cole, then over Cole's shoulder at his cowering wife. "She is my wife," Thomas spat. "I will do as I please. Not while I'm standing here. You won't." Thomas's face turned a mottled purple. "You think you can give orders in my house? You are nothing but a stray dog I took in out of the cold, a drifter with no name and no dirt to stand on. I could shoot you where you stand, and the law would pin a medal on me." Cole did not flinch. "You can try, but you are not going to touch her. Not tonight." The two men stared at each other. The silence stretched, thin and tight as a wire. Thomas was big, and he was strong, but he was also a bully. And bullies, Cole knew, did not like a fair fight. He saw the doubt flicker in Thomas's eyes. Thomas looked at Cole's hands, which were loose at his sides, near the knife on his belt. Thomas let out a harsh, barking laugh. He stepped back, straightening his coat. "You are fired. Hart, pack your roll. I will pack in the morning," Cole said. "When the light is good," Thomas sneered. "Fine. Sleep in the barn with the rest of the animals. That is where you belong." He turned and looked at Hannah with disgust. "You two deserve each other. Weakness loves company." Thomas grabbed the whiskey bottle from the sideboard and stormed toward the door. He slammed it behind him so hard the window panes rattled in their frames. A moment later, they heard the heavy barn door creak open and slam shut. He would sleep in the tack room, as he often did when the rage took him, drinking until he passed out. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The fire in the stove crackled, a small, domestic sound that seemed absurd after the violence. Hannah was still pressed into the corner. She was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering. The coffee stain on her skirt was dark and spreading. Cole stood still for a moment, listening to make sure Thomas was truly gone. Then he turned slowly. "Hannah," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with shock. He threw the chair," she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. Cole stepped over the broken wood. He reached out, his hands hovering, unsure. "Are you burned? The coffee?" "No," she said. "It hit my boots. I am fine." She was not fine. She was shattering. The years of fear, of walking on eggshells, of swallowing her voice. It all cracked open. "Thank you," she choked out. Her face crumpled. No one has ever... She began to weep. It wasn't a gentle crying. It was a jagged, ugly sobbing that shook her entire body. She slid down the wall, sinking to the floor amidst the wreckage of the chair. Cole didn't think. He dropped to his knees in front of her. "Hannah, don't, please!" He reached for her, his hands gripping her shoulders to steady her. She felt frail under his palms, like a bird with hollow bones. "I am so afraid," she gasped, looking up at him through her tears. "I am afraid all the time. Cole, I am trapped here. The wind, the snow. Him I cannot breathe. I know." Cole whispered. His voice was thick with emotion. "I know." He looked at her tear-streaked face, her hair coming loose from its pins, the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the restraint he had built up over months. The wall he had constructed brick by brick crumbled. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not just the cowboy, not just the protector, but the man. She saw the loneliness in him that matched her own. She saw the hunger. "Cole," she breathed. The distance between them vanished. He leaned in, and she met him. It was not a movie kiss. It was not graceful. It was desperate. Their mouths collided, awkward and hard. Cole's hands moved from her shoulders to her face, cradling her jaw, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. His beard was rough against her skin, scratching her, but the sensation was grounding, real. Hannah made a small sound in her throat and clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer. She tasted the coffee on his breath, the salt of her own tears. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no blizzard, no Thomas, no judgmental town. There was only the heat of his body, the solid weight of him, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that she was not alone. The kiss deepened, becoming slow and intense. Years of starvation were being fed. It was a pouring out of grief and a drinking in of comfort. Cole groaned low in his chest, his other arm going around her waist, pulling her against him as they knelt on the kitchen floor. Then, reality rushed back in. The sound of the wind rattling the door, the sight of the broken chair, the ring on her finger. Hannah pulled back with a gasp. She scrambled backward, her hands flying to her mouth. Her eyes were wide with horror. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, what have we done?" Cole remained kneeling, his chest heaving, his hand still reaching out toward her before falling to his side. He looked dazed, his eyes dark and dilated. "Hannah," he said, his voice ragged. "I am married," she said, her voice shaking. "I am a married woman. This is a sin, a mortal sin." Cole looked down at the floor. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. It did not feel like a sin to him. It felt like the first breath of clean air he had taken in 10 years. But he saw the terror in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should not have. I lost my head." "The town," Hannah whispered, staring at nothing. "If they knew, they would stone us. They would hang you. And Thomas would kill you." "He probably would," Cole admitted grimly. He looked up at her. "Do you want me to leave? Tonight, I can pack my roll and walk." Hannah looked at him. The thought of him walking out into the freezing dark, leaving her alone in this house with Thomas, made her chest constrict with panic. "No," she said quickly. "No, you cannot go. Not in this cold. You would die. Then what do? We stop," she said. She stood up, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands, trying to regain some semblance of the woman she was supposed to be. "We pretend this never happened. We bury it. It was the fear, the shock. That is all." Cole stood up slowly. He looked at her, and she could see the doubt in his eyes. They both knew it was not just the shock, but he nodded. "All right, Hannah, if that is what you want, it is what we must do." He nodded again. "I will go to the bunkhouse. Thomas will be asleep by now." He walked to the door. His hand hovered over the latch. He did not look back. "Good night, Mrs. McCree. Good night, Mr. Hart." He walked out, and the cold air rushed in to take his place. Hannah stood in the kitchen, Shivering, her lips still burning from his touch, she touched them again, softly. She prayed for forgiveness, but the prayer felt hollow, because in her heart, she was already waiting for the next time. The weeks that followed were a purgatory of ice and fire. The land itself seemed to mirror their turmoil. The weather turned erratic. One day, a Chinook wind would blow down from the mountains, warm and dry, melting the snow into slush and trickling rivulets of mud. The river would crack and groan, the ice breaking up in violent, heaving sheets. Then, just as quickly, the north wind would return, screaming down the valley, freezing the mud into iron-hard ruts and locking the river in ice again. The trees, confused by the thaw, would creak and snap in the sudden freeze, the sound echoing like gunshots across the prairie. Hannah and Cole moved through this landscape like sleepwalkers. They kept their promise. They did not touch. They did not speak of that night on the floor, but the denial only made the tension worse. Every shared task became heavy with meaning. When Hannah handed him the milk pail, their eyes would meet for a fraction of a second, and in that glance, the memory of the kiss would flash between them like a spark. When Cole sat by the fire in the evenings, Thomas having forgotten or ignored his command to fire him in the sobriety of the next morning, Hannah would watch the firelight play on his hands, remembering how they felt on her face. Survival required constant vigilance. They had to watch the cattle for signs of weakness. They had to watch the sky for signs of storms. And they had to watch themselves, constantly, to keep the secret from spilling out. In late February, Hannah went to town alone for the Sunday service. Thomas refused to go, claiming his back hurt, but really he just wanted to nurse a bottle without the preacher's eyes on him. After the service, Hannah stood on the steps of the small white church, wrapping her scarf tight. The wind was whipping the snow around the gravestones in the yard. Mrs. McCree. Hannah turned. It was Mrs. Avery. She was a young woman, only a few years older than Hannah, but her face was lined with the hardship of widowhood. Her husband had died 3 years ago in a riding accident, leaving her with a small plot of land and a reputation that had to be guarded like gold. Mrs. Avery, Hannah said politely. Mrs. Avery stepped closer, lowering her voice. She looked around to make sure the deacon was not listening. I wanted to speak with you, Hannah, as a friend, of course, Mrs. Avery hesitated, then looked Hannah in the eye. People are talking. Hannah's stomach dropped. About what? About the ranch? About Thomas and... about the hired man? Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. Mr. Hart? He is just a hand. He works for us. I know that, Mrs. Avery said gently. And you know that, but this town has a long memory and a short temper. They see a woman alone on a ranch with a husband who spends half his time in a bottle and a cowboy who looks, well, like Mr. Hart looks. She touched Hannah's arm. They are watching you. Hannah, the women in the sewing circle, the men at the saloon, they are waiting for a slip. Why are you telling me this? Hannah whispered. Because I know what it is to be judged, Mrs. Avery said, her eyes sad. A man can do as he pleases. He can drink. He can cheat. He can be cruel. And the town will shrug and say, that is just a man. But a woman's reputation is like a pane of glass. One crack, and it is ruined forever. And once it is broken, it cuts you. She squeezed Hannah's arm. Be careful, Hannah, for your own sake, Mrs. Avery turned and walked away, her black skirt swishing against the snow. Hannah stood frozen on the church steps. She looked out at the town, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the windows that looked like unblinking eyes. She felt the trap closing in. She thought of Cole, back at the ranch, chopping wood in the cold. She thought of Thomas, drinking in the parlor. She realized then that the kiss had not been the end of something, nor the beginning. It was the lighting of a fuse, and no matter how much snow fell, it was only a matter of time before the explosion came. Spring did not come to the Wyoming territory with a gentle hand. It arrived like a fever breaking, violent and sweaty. The silence of the winter was shattered by the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Water rushing in the gullies. Water roaring in the riverbeds. The white plains dissolved into a landscape of gray slush and black mud. A thick, sucking gumbo that pulled at boots and hooves with the grip of a drowning man. The air smelled of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and the sharp, clean scent of ozone. It was a smell of life, but life in its rawest, most chaotic form. The crisis struck on a Tuesday in late March. The temperature had spiked overnight, a sudden warm front colliding with the deep snowpack in the high country. By noon, the creek that bordered the McCree land had swollen into a brown torrent, chewing at its banks. By 2 o'clock, the river in the lower pasture had breached the shallows, turning the grazing land into a lake of swirling, debris-filled water. Thomas shouted orders from the porch, his face red with exertion and anger. As if the river were a disobedient hand he could browbeat into submission. "Get the horses," he bellowed. "The herd is bunched against the south ridge. If we do not move them to the high ground, we will lose half the calves." Hannah did not wait to be told. She hiked her skirts up, tying them with a piece of twine, and pulled on her heavy rubber boots. She grabbed a slicker that smelled of old oil and ran for the barn. Cole was already saddling the horses. He moved with a grim efficiency, his face set in hard lines. He threw a saddle onto Thomas's big bay and then turned to his own mount. "Stay close to the ridge. Hannah," he said as she entered the barn. "The current is strong enough to take a horse down. I can ride. Mr. Hart," she said, grabbing the bridle of her mare. "I know you can," he said, tightening the cinch. "Just be careful." They rode out into a world that had lost its edges. The sky was a low, bruised purple, dumping rain in sheets that stung the skin. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and ice. For 4 hours, they fought the land. Thomas rode point, whipping his horse through the rising water, cursing the cattle, the weather, and God with equal fervor. Cole worked the flank, whistling and shouting, driving the frightened, bellowing beasts away from the rising water. Hannah rode the drag, pushing the stragglers, her arms aching from swinging the rope, her voice hoarse from shouting. The cattle were stupid with fear. They tried to turn back toward the familiar willows, which were now half submerged in the rushing brown flood. It was a chaotic, muddy battle. Near the bend of the river, a calf broke away, splashing frantically toward a spit of land that was rapidly disappearing. Hannah turned her mare, spurring the horse into the shallow water. "Get back!" she screamed at the animal, waving her hat. The calf bawled, slipping on the slick rocks. Hannah dismounted, judging the water to be shallow enough, needing to physically turn the animal. Her boot splashed into the freezing current. She grabbed the calf by the ear and the tail, shoving it toward the bank. "Go on." The calf scrambled up the mud, rejoining the herd. Hannah turned to follow, but her boot found no purchase on a moss-slicked rock. She went down hard. The water, which looked shallow, possessed a terrifying weight. It grabbed her skirts and pulled. In a heartbeat, she was sliding toward the deeper channel, the roar of the river filling her ears. She clawed at the mud, but it disintegrated in her grip. A dark shape blocked the sky. Cole had abandoned his horse. He splashed into the water, bracing himself against the current. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a grip that bruised. He hauled her up, dragging her against the force of the river until they were on the muddy bank. Hannah stumbled, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She slipped again in the mud, and this time, Cole caught her around the waist. He pulled her tight against him, anchoring her. They stood there, ankle deep in mud, soaked to the bone, rain streaming down their faces. Hannah was gasping for air, her chest heaving against his. She could feel the hard wall of his chest, the heat of his body radiating through the wet canvas of his coat. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough, shouting over the roar of the water. "No!" she choked out. "No, I am fine." She looked up at him. Water dripped from the brim of his hat onto her face. His eyes were wide, dark with fear, not for himself, but for her. His arm was a band of iron around her waist. holding her as if he would never let the river take her. For a moment, they did not move. The cattle lowed in the distance. The river thundered, and the rain hammered down. But in the circle of his arms, there was a sudden, terrifying stillness. Hannah's hands were clutching the front of his coat, holding on for dear life. "I am sorry," she whispered, the words lost in the noise of the flood. "I am so sorry." She did not know what she was apologizing for slipping, for being weak, or for the way her body was betraying her, leaning into him, craving his warmth in the middle of the disaster. Cole stared at her, his jaw working. Then, slowly, he loosened his grip. "Get to the high ground," he said, his voice dropping. "I will finish here." He stepped back, turning away before she could say more, plunging back into the work as if the physical exertion could burn away the moment that had just passed between them. By sunset, the cattle were safe on the upper plateau. The rain had not stopped. Thomas sat on his horse, looking out toward the distant northern range. The river had cut off access to the north pasture, where 100 head were grazing. "I have to go check the north herd," Thomas announced, wiping rain from his face. "If they try to cross the ford tonight, they will drown." "Can it not wait until morning?" Hannah asked, shivering in her wet clothes. "The river is too high to cross." "Thomas, there is a bridge at the narrow gap, 5 miles up." Thomas said, "I will cross there. I will stay at the line shack tonight and push them back at first light." He looked at Cole. "Hart, you stay here. Check the barn roof. I do not want any leaks ruining the winter feed we have left." "Yes, boss," Cole said. He did not look at Hannah. Thomas turned his horse and rode into the gathering dark, a driven man who cared more for his assets than his life or his wife. The house felt different when Hannah entered it alone. It was not just empty. It was waiting. She stripped off her wet coat and boots, leaving them by the door. She lit the stove, her hands trembling so much she wasted 3 matches. She put the coffee pot on to boil. Outside, the rain beat a relentless rhythm on the roof, 1,000 fingers drumming against the shingles. It locked them in. She heard the barn door close, then bootsteps on the porch. Cole came in. He was soaked. His hat was in his hand, water dripping from the brim onto the floorboards. He looked at her, then looked away, hanging his coat on the peg. He walked to the stove and held his hands out to the warmth. He did not speak. Hannah stood by the table, gripping the back of a chair. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was not the comfortable silence of 2 people resting after work. It was the silence of a dam about to burst. She watched his back. She saw the way his wet shirt clung to his shoulders. She saw the tension in his neck. I should make supper," Hannah said. Her voice sounded thin and foreign to her own ears. Cole did not turn around. "You do not have to cook for me." "Hannah, I want to," she said. She took a step toward the pantry, then stopped. She could not pretend about flour and salt, not tonight. The adrenaline from the river was still coursing through her veins, making her skin prickle. She felt alive in a way she had not felt in years. She felt the ghost of the water rushing past her legs, the memory of his arm around her waist. She began to pace the small kitchen. 3 steps to the window, 3 steps to the table. She felt like a trapped animal. Her conscience was screaming at her, "You are a married woman. He is your husband's man. This is ruin. This is hellfire." But her heart was beating a different drum. It was beating for the warmth she had felt in the mud. Cole turned slowly. He leaned against the warm iron of the stove, watching her pace. His face was in shadow, but his eyes followed her every movement. "You are going to wear a hole in the floor," he said softly. Hannah stopped. She looked at him across the room. The distance was 10 feet, but it felt like a canyon they were both afraid to bridge. "He is gone," Hannah whispered. Cole nodded. "I know. He is not coming back tonight. The bridge, the line shack. I know, Hannah." She looked at the window, where the rain blurred the glass into a dark mirror. "He is coming home tonight," she whispered again, the words slipping out. It was a lie. Thomas was miles away. She said it as a talisman, a desperate attempt to summon the walls of her duty, to remind herself of the cage she lived in. He is coming home tonight meant I am not free. It meant, stop this! Cole pushed himself off the stove. He took one step toward her, then another. The sound of his boots on the wood was deliberate. He stopped 2 feet away from her. The smell of rain and wet wool and man filled her senses. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with a conflict that mirrored her own. He saw the terror in her face, but he also saw the longing that she could not hide. Then make it count, he murmured. The words hung in the air for a heartbeat. Make it count. If the time is stolen, steal it all. If the doom is coming, let it come for something real. He reached out and took her face in his hands. His palms were rough, hot against her cool skin. Hannah made a small, choked sound. Cole lowered his head and kissed her. It was not gentle. There was no hesitation this time, no tentative testing of the waters. It was raw urgency. It was a collision. He kissed her as if he were starving and she was bread. He kissed her as if the river were still trying to drag them apart. Hannah clutched at his shirt, her fingers tangling in the damp fabric. A sob broke in her throat, and she opened her mouth to him, answering his hunger with a ferocity that shocked her. Years of silence, of biting her tongue, of making herself small, it all poured out in that kiss. Tears slipped from her eyes, hot and fast, mixing with the rain still damp on his face. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, the terrifying, overwhelming relief of being wanted, not owned. Wanted. Cole groaned against her mouth, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her body flush against his. He lifted her slightly, and she clung to him, her feet leaving the floor. He began to move them, not away from each other, but deeper into the house. He walked her backward, small, stumbling steps. They bumped into the table, then the doorframe of the bedroom. At every threshold, Cole stopped. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his breath ragged. "Hannah," he rasped. "Tell me to stop." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the scar on his jaw, the worry lines around his eyes, the naked vulnerability. "No," she whispered. He kissed her again, harder, and took another step. At the foot of the bed, he stopped again. His hands shook as he reached for the buttons of her dress. He undid the top one, then paused, his fingers lingering on her throat. "You can still tell me to go," he said. "I will go. Hannah, I will sleep in the mud if you say the word." Hannah reached up and covered his hands with hers. She pressed his palm against her beating heart. "If you go," she said, her voice trembling, "I will die of the cold." She chose him. In the dark, with the rain hammering the roof like judgment, she chose him. They fell onto the bed together. The quilt was cold, but they did not feel it. Their intimacy was not the frantic, rough taking she had known with Thomas. It was intense. Yes, but it was a desperate kind of worship. Cole touched her as if she were made of something precious and breakable. Yet he held her with a strength that promised she would not break. In the darkness, the silence of the house was replaced by whispered confessions. "I have never—" Hannah gasped, her fingers tracing the ridges of old scars on his back, scars from a whip, scars from barbed wire. "I have never felt like this, like I am really here. You are here," Cole whispered into her hair. "You are the only thing that is here." He kissed her eyelids, her throat, the pulse at her wrist. "You deserve more. Hannah, you deserve more than fear. You deserve more than cold nights and a man who looks through you." "I thought I was invisible," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I saw you," he said. "From the first moment, I saw you. It was a connection of souls as much as bodies. It was two lonely people finding a common language in the dark. It was the weaving together of two tattered lives into something that, for a few hours, felt whole. Afterward, the storm outside seemed to have quieted, or perhaps they just could not hear it anymore. Hannah lay with her head on Cole's chest. She could hear the steady, strong beat of his heart. His arm was draped over her, heavy and protective. She stared at the ceiling, where the shadows danced. A wave of shame washed over her, cold and sharp. She was an adulteress. The Bible was clear. The town would be clear. If they knew, they would strip her name from her, cast her out, maybe even kill her. She had broken the most sacred vow a woman could make. But then Cole shifted, his hand moving to stroke her hair, a gentle, absent-minded gesture of affection. And the shame collided with a fierce, aching joy. She felt alive, for the first time in 5 years, since she had stepped off the train in this harsh territory. She felt like a living, breathing woman. She felt cherished. Is it wrong, she whispered into the dark, to be happy, even for an hour? Cole was silent for a long time. Then he kissed the top of her head. If this is wrong, Hannah, then I do not want to be right. The world is hard enough. We take the warmth where we find it. Before the first gray light of dawn touched the window, Cole sat up. The air in the room was freezing again. The fire in the stove had died down. He dressed in silence, his movements efficient but reluctant. He sat on the edge of the bed to pull on his boots. Hannah sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. She reached out and touched his back. "Be careful," she whispered. Cole turned. He took her hand and kissed the palm, closing her fingers over the kiss. "I will wait for the signal," he said softly. "When the coast is clear." He stood up, put on his hat, and slipped out the door. The latch clicked shut, and Hannah was alone. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The pale light crept under the curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room looked the same as it always had, the same picture on the washstand, the same faded rug, but everything had changed. She slid to her knees on the cold floorboards. She clasped her hands and bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, "forgive me. I know what I have done. I know I have strayed." She waited for the weight of condemnation to crush her, but it did not come. Instead, she remembered the way Cole had looked at her in the mud. "But Lord," she continued, her voice fierce and low, "do not let him take this from me. Do not let Thomas hurt him. Please, if I must burn, let me burn, but keep him safe." Thomas returned in the late afternoon. The mud was drying in the yard, turning into a crusted, cracked surface. Hannah was on the porch, churning butter. She heard the horse before she saw him. Thomas rode in, his horse caked in dried mud to the withers. He looked exhausted and sour. His eyes were bloodshot from wind and lack of sleep. Hannah stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Welcome home, Thomas," she said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Thomas swung down from the saddle. He grunted, tossing the reins toward the hitching post. "Damn river," he muttered. Bridge was out. Had to ride 10 miles north to find a crossing. He stepped onto the porch. He stopped in front of Hannah. He did not kiss her. He never did. But he looked at her. He looked at her hard. Hannah tried to meet his gaze, to be the dutiful wife she had always been. But her eyes flickered away. She looked at his shoulder, at the doorframe, anywhere but into the eyes of the man she had betrayed. Thomas frowned. He sniffed the air, like a hound catching a scent. He looked toward the barn, where Cole was nowhere to be seen. Then back at Hannah. "You look flushed," he said slowly. I have been churning." Hannah said, "It is hard work." Thomas narrowed his eyes. He stepped closer, invading her space. He reached out and touched her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You look different," he said. He dropped his hand and brushed past her into the house. Hannah let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. He knew. He didn't know what he knew, or how he knew. But he sensed the shift. The control he exerted over her had slipped, and he could feel the slack in the line. The following weeks were a high-wire act performed without a net. They tried. God. They tried to act as if nothing had happened. They returned to the formal modes of address. Mr. Hart, Mrs. McCree. They kept their distance in the yard. But the house was too small, and the memory of that night was too big. It was in the small things. It was in the way Hannah's hand trembled when she passed him the bread at supper. It was in the way Cole stood a little straighter when she entered the room, and it was in the stolen moments. One afternoon, in the tack room, Hannah went to fetch a new cinch for Thomas. Cole was there, oiling a saddle. They froze. The door was half open. Anyone could walk by. Cole dropped his rag. He took one step, and she took one step. He reached out and squeezed her hand, just a quick, hard pressure of fingers intertwining. "Are you all right?" he whispered. "I'm scared," she whispered back. "He is watching us. I know. Be brave, Hannah." Then he let go, and she walked out with a cinch, her heart racing as if she had just run a mile. Every touch was a risk. Every glance was a gamble with their lives. But it felt impossible to refuse. It was the only water in the desert. The land itself seemed to sense the danger. The weather turned violent again, as if the spring could not decide whether to nurture the earth or destroy it. Thunderstorms rolled across the plains with terrifying frequency. Great towers of black clouds would build in the west, blotting out the sun. Lightning would fork down, striking the ridges, the smell of ozone and burning grass filling the air. One evening, a storm slammed a door in the house with a violence that made Hannah scream. Thomas looked up from his ledger, his eyes cold and flat. "You are jumpy, woman," he said, like a cat with a guilty conscience. Hannah stared at the lightning flashing outside the window. She felt like the west itself was watching them. The wind was listening at the keyhole. The thunder was the sound of a gavel coming down. They were defying the brutal moral order of the frontier. They were stealing happiness in a land that demanded suffering. And Hannah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the bill was coming due. The discovery happened on a Tuesday, in the quiet, dusty stillness of the hayloft. Thomas had gone up to pitch hay for the horses, a task he usually delegated to the hired help, but his suspicion had made him restless. He was looking for something, though he did not know what, until he saw it half buried in the loose straw near the loft door. It was a handkerchief, a small square of white linen edged with delicate lace, embroidered with a pale blue H. It was not a thing that belonged in a barn. It belonged in a church pocket or a dresser drawer. Thomas picked it up. It was stained with a speck of grease, but when he raised it to his face, he could still smell the faint, floral scent of lavender water. It was the scent Hannah dabbed on her neck on Sunday mornings. Thomas did not yell. He did not storm down the ladder and wave the cloth in their faces. Instead, a cold, heavy silence settled over him. He folded the handkerchief carefully into a small square and placed it in the breast pocket of his vest, right over his heart. He patted it once, like a man securing a valuable deed. He descended the ladder with slow, heavy steps. From the barn door, he watched the yard. Hannah was by the chicken coop, throwing grain. Cole was by the forge, sharpening an axe. They were 30 yards apart. They were not looking at each other. But Thomas, watching with the new clarity of a predator, saw the invisible line that connected them. He saw how Cole paused in his grinding when Hannah laughed at a fluttering hen. He saw how Hannah's body angled toward the forge, like a flower turning toward the sun. Thomas smiled, but it was a grimacing, mirthless thing. He decided he would not kill the snake immediately. He would step on its tail first and watch it writhe. The torture began at supper that night. The wind was howling outside, rattling the panes, but the kitchen was warm. Thomas ate his roast beef with precise, mechanical chews. "I was thinking," Thomas said, wiping his mouth with his napkin. "The South Corral needs reposting. The ground is thawing, and the posts are rotting out." He looked at Cole. "It is a two-person job. One to hold the post, one to tamp the earth." Cole nodded, keeping his eyes on his plate. "I can manage it, boss." "No," Thomas said softly. "You will need help. Hannah can go with you." Hannah looked up, her fork freezing halfway to her mouth. "Me, Thomas? I have the washing to do. And the bread, the washing can wait," Thomas said. His voice was light, conversational, but his eyes were flat and dead. "I want to make sure the job is done right. And you have been looking pale. Hannah, fresh air will do you good. Besides, I want to see how well you two work together." He let the silence stretch, tight as a bowstring. I have noticed you two seem to have a rhythm. Cole looked up then, his gray eyes meeting Thomas's stare. We do the work that needs doing, McCree. That is all. Of course, Thomas said. That is all. For the next 3 days, he invented tasks that forced them into proximity. He made them repair the wagon wheel together, Hannah holding the heavy iron rim while Cole hammered it into place, their faces inches apart, sweat mixing in the heat of the afternoon. He made them sort the seed corn in the granary. And all the while, Thomas sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle. He would run the oil rag down the barrel, snap the action open and shut, and watch them. He said nothing. He just watched. The air in the house became suffocating. Every glance was dangerous. Every accidental brush of a sleeve sent a jolt of terror through Hannah. She felt like a mouse in a jar, waiting for the hand to descend. In town, the atmosphere was no better. On Sunday, Thomas insisted they go to church. He walked Hannah up the steps with his hand gripping her elbow so hard she could feel his fingers bruising the bone. After the service, the congregation milled about in the muddy street. The air was thick with judgment. Hannah stood by the wagon while Thomas spoke to the banker. She felt the eyes on her back. Mrs. Gable, the deacon's wife, was standing near the mercantile with 2 other women. She did not lower her voice. It is shameful. Really, Mrs., Gable said, adjusting her bonnet. A hired man living under the same roof all winter. And the way he looks at her, you would think he owned the place. Or owned the livestock. Another woman tittered. Hannah feels the blood drain from her face. She stared at the mud on her boots, wishing the earth would open up and swallow her. Another voice, sharper and crueler, drifted over. Well, Thomas McCree is a hard man, but he cannot be that blind, unless he is too proud to admit he has been made a fool of in his own bed. Hannah climbed into the wagon, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the rail. She felt the walls closing in. The ranch was a prison, and the town was a courtroom where the verdict had already been read. The explosion finally came on a Thursday night. The supper dishes had been cleared. Cole had excused himself to the bunkhouse, the tension in the room having become physically painful. Thomas was sitting at the table, drinking from a bottle of rye. He had been drinking since noon. Hannah was at the sink, pumping water to wash the plates. Her back was to him. Thomas reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out the handkerchief. He laid it on the table. Do you know where I found this? He asked. Hannah turned. She saw the scrap of white lace against the dark wood. Her heart stopped. It was the handkerchief she had lost weeks ago. She had dropped it in the hayloft the day she had gone up there to cry. And Cole had found her, and they had held hands for 5 minutes in the silence. I must have dropped it, she stammered. In the hayloft. Thomas said, Yes, I was looking for eggs. The hens sometimes lay up there. Thomas stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He walked toward her. He did not sway. The liquor had not made him clumsy. It had made him focused. There are no nests in the loft. Hannah. He stopped a foot from her. He smelled of rye and old sweat. I want to hear you say it, he whispered. Say what? Thomas, say that you are a whore. Hannah gasped, stepping back until her spine hit the cupboard. Thomas! He lunged. He grabbed her by the shoulders and slammed her against the wall. The plates on the shelf rattled, and one crashed to the floor, shattering. Confess! He screamed, his face contorted with rage. Do not lie to me, woman. I have seen the way you look at him. I have seen the way you walk around him like a bitch in heat. I have done nothing, Hannah cried, tears springing to her eyes from the pain of his grip. He shook her, his fingers digging into her arms. Bruises were already blooming under the fabric of her dress. You think I am stupid? You think I do not know? Tell me, did you lay with him? Did you let that drifter touch you in my house? Hannah stared at him, her breath coming in sobbing gasps. She would not lie, but she would not give him the satisfaction of the truth. Her silence was a defiance, a dangerous, heavy thing. I hate you, she whispered. Thomas roared, raising his hand to strike her. Thomas! The door crashed open. Cole stood there, framed by the night. He was breathing hard, having run from the bunkhouse at the sound of the scream. Thomas froze, his hand raised. He turned his head slowly to look at Cole. "Get out." "Hart!" Thomas snarled. "This is family business." "Let her go," Cole said. His voice was low, shaking with suppressed violence. Thomas laughed. He shoved Hannah away. She stumbled, catching herself on the table, clutching her bruised arm. "You want her?" Thomas sneered. "You want my leavings?" He reached behind his back, under his coat. When his hand came out, it held a heavy Colt revolver. The metal gleamed dull blue in the lamplight. Thomas leveled the gun at Cole's chest. "I should have done this the day you rode in," Thomas said. "I should have put a bullet in you and saved us all the trouble." Cole did not move. He did not reach for his own weapon. He stood with his hands open at his sides, his eyes locked on Thomas's face. "Shooting me will not change anything. McCree, it will stop you from breathing," Thomas said, thumbing back the hammer. The click was loud in the small room. "It will not make her love you," Cole said. "And it will not erase what you are. A man who hits women. A man who steals land. A man who is so small he has to crush everyone around him just to feel big." "Shut up!" Thomas screamed. "You are afraid," Cole said, taking a slow step forward. "You are afraid because you know she deserves better. You know you lost her a long time ago, before I ever walked through that gate." "Die!" Thomas shrieked. Thomas pulled the trigger. At the last fraction of a second, Cole lunged to the side. The gun roared, a deafening boom in the enclosed space. Cole felt a searing hot iron burn across his left side, just above the hip. The bullet missed his vitals but tore through flesh and slammed into the window behind him, shattering the glass. Wind and dust blew into the room instantly, swirling the smoke. Hannah screamed, a high, piercing sound of terror. Cole did not stop. He crashed into Thomas, driving his shoulder into the larger man's chest. The momentum knocked Thomas backward. He hit the stove, his head cracking against the iron pipe with a sickening thud. The gun skittered across the floor. Thomas slid down to the floor, stunned, his eyes rolling back in his head. Cole staggered back, clutching his side. Blood was already seeping through his fingers, dark and wet. "Cole!" Hannah cried, rushing to him. "We have to go!" Cole gasped. He gritted his teeth against the pain. He will wake up, and he will not miss twice. He grabbed Hannah's hand. "Now! Hannah, run!" They burst out of the house into the night. The weather had turned again. A storm was building. Heavy clouds blotting out the stars. Lightning flickering on the horizon like distant artillery. They ran to the corral. Cole moved stiffly, favoring his left side. He didn't bother with saddles. He grabbed 2 bridles from the fence rail and forced the bits into the mouths of the nearest horses, Hannah's mare and the roan gelding. He boosted Hannah up, his face gray with pain and the flashes of lightning. "Ride north," he ordered, swinging himself onto the roan with a groan of agony. "Toward the Badlands. There is an old line shack near the canyon rim. He will not look there tonight." They galloped out of the yard, the hooves thundering on the hard-packed earth. Behind them, the house stood dark and ominous, a sleeping beast that would soon wake. The ride was a blur of terror. The wind whipped Hannah's hair across her face, blinding her. The horses stumbled on the uneven ground, skittish from the smell of the storm and the blood on Cole's clothes. They rode for hours, climbing higher into the rough, broken country where the plains gave way to ravines and scrub pine. The lightning grew closer, illuminating the landscape in stark, strobe light flashes, steep drop-offs, jagged rocks, the skeletal limbs of dead trees. Coyotes howled in the distance, a chorus of yips and wails that sounded like laughter. Hannah clung to her horse's mane, her eyes fixed on Cole's back. He was slumped forward, swaying slightly with the rhythm of the gallop. Every time he slipped, her heart stopped, terrified he would fall. Finally, just as the rain began to fall in heavy, cold drops, they saw the shack. It was little more than a pile of rotting logs backed up against a rock face, abandoned by a trapper or a failed homesteader years ago. The roof was half collapsed, and the door hung on one hinge. They pulled the horses up. Cole slid from the roan's back and collapsed onto the wet ground. "Cole!" Hannah scrambled down. She ran to him, falling to her knees in the mud. I am all right," he wheezed. "Just took the wind out of me." She helped him up, getting his arm over her shoulder. She dragged him into the shelter of the shack. It smelled of rat droppings and dry rot, but it was out of the wind. She lowered him onto the dirt floor. It was pitch black. "I need light," she whispered. She fumbled in his coat pocket, finding a box of lucifer matches. She struck one. The flare of light revealed his face, pale as death, covered in a sheen of sweat. His shirt was soaked with blood from his ribs to his waist. Hannah felt a wave of nausea, but she shoved it down. She was a rancher's wife. She had seen blood before. She gathered a pile of dry tumbleweeds and old wood from the corner and started a small fire. The smoke stung her eyes, but the flickering light allowed her to see the wound. She peeled back his shirt. The bullet had plowed a furrow along his side, deep and ugly. It had missed the gut. Thank God, but it had torn muscle and nicked a rib. It was bleeding sluggishly now, oozing dark red. "I need to bind it," she said, her voice shaking. She stood up and lifted her dress. She grabbed the hem of her white cotton petticoat and ripped. The sound of tearing fabric was loud in the small space. She tore long strips, her hands working with a desperate speed. "This will hurt," she warned him. "Do it," he gritted out. She pressed a pad of folded cloth against the wound. Cole cried out, his back arching off the dirt, a guttural sound of pain that tore at her heart. I am sorry, she wept, pressing harder to staunch the flow. She wrapped the strips around his waist, tying them tight. Cole fell back, panting, his eyes closed. Hannah sat back on her heels, her hands covered in his blood. She looked at him, scarred, broken, hunted, and she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that she was exactly where she belonged. "You should have left me," Cole whispered without opening his eyes. "You should have stayed. He would not have killed you." "No," Hannah said fiercely. She took his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "I would rather be here, in the dirt, with the whole world against us, than spend one more night in that house without you. I would rather face the town's hatred than a life where I am invisible." Cole opened his eyes. He looked at her in the firelight. "I have nothing to give you, Hannah, no name, no land, just a price on my head. You have given me myself," she said. "That is enough." In the darkness of the shack, with the storm raging outside, their love hardened. It stripped away the soft edges of romance and became something elemental. It was a pact of survival. Cole turned his head, looking at the fire. "My mother used to say I was cursed," he murmured, his voice slurred with exhaustion and pain. "Said I was born with a restless feet, that I would wander until I died, and lose everything I ever tried to hold." He squeezed her hand weakly. "I'm afraid, Hannah, I'm afraid I will lose you, that the curse is real." Hannah leaned down and kissed his forehead. It was cool and clammy. "Then let us be cursed together," she whispered. "I do not care about the future. Cole, I only care about now." While they huddled in the shack, Thomas McCree was busy. He had woken with a headache that blinded him, but his rage was a fuel that burned hotter than pain. He rode into town at dawn, his arm in a sling, a dramatic touch for an injury that was merely a bruise. He went straight to the saloon, where the early risers were gathering. He told a story that twisted the truth into a knot no one could untie. "He tried to kill me," Thomas shouted, slamming his good hand on the bar. "That drifter, Hart, I caught him stealing my silver, and when I confronted him, he pulled a gun." The men muttered, shaking their heads. They had always suspected the quiet cowboy. And then, Thomas's voice broke, a masterful performance of a grieving husband. Then he took Hannah. She tried to run, but he dragged her onto a horse. He has taken her into the hills. God knows what he will do to her. The town, already primed by gossip and prejudice, swallowed the lie whole. It was easier to believe that a drifter was a villain than to believe a respectable rancher drove his wife away. "Gather a posse," someone shouted. "Hang the bastard," yelled another. Thomas watched them, his eyes glittering. He had turned the town into his weapon, but not everyone was convinced. At the back of the room, the sheriff stood watching. He was an older man, with a mustache gray as iron and eyes that had seen too many lies. He noticed that Thomas's story changed slightly with each telling. He remembered the rumors of the missing homesteader, and outside the mercantile, Mrs. Avery heard the news and felt a cold stone in her stomach. She remembered the bruises she had seen on Hannah's arm weeks ago. She remembered the fear in Hannah's eyes. Kidnapped? She thought. Or rescued? The sheriff walked out to his horse. He adjusted his hat. "Where are you going, Sheriff?" Thomas asked. "Following him out. To lead the posse." "I'm going to ride out," the sheriff said evenly. "But I ride alone. McCree, I do not need a mob to do the law's work. You bring him back draped over a saddle." Thomas growled. "Dead or alive, I will bring back the truth," the sheriff said. "Whatever that is, up in the Badlands." The days began to blur. The storm passed, leaving behind a scorching, unnatural heat. The sun beat down on the shack, baking the wood and turning the air inside to an oven. They had no food. They had only the water Hannah collected from a thin, muddy trickle that ran down the rock face behind the shack. She strained it through her petticoat, feeding it to Cole sip by sip. Cole's fever spiked on the second day. He tossed and turned, muttering about cattle drives and fires. Hannah bathed his face with a cool rag, singing hymns softly to soothe him, not the angry hymns of her father, but the gentle ones about rivers and rest. Survival became a war of inches. Hannah learned to throw rocks at the vultures that circled too close to the horses. She learned to ignore the gnawing hunger in her belly. The landscape pressed in on them, the red rocks, the scratching pines, the vast, empty sky. It was beautiful and indifferent. It did not care if they lived or died, but in that crucible, their bond fused into something unbreakable. On the third afternoon, Cole's fever broke. He woke up clear-eyed. Though weak as a kitten, he watched Hannah trying to catch a lizard near the door, her face gaunt, her dress torn and dirty. "Hannah," he rasped. She turned, her face lighting up with a smile that cracked the grime on her skin. "You are back." "I am back," he said. He pushed himself up to a sitting position, wincing. "We cannot stay here. They will come. Thomas will not stop." "I know," she said, coming to sit beside him. "We have to move. Tomorrow, even if I have to tie myself to the saddle." "Where will we go?" she asked. "West," he said. "Over the mountains. There are valleys in Oregon where the rain is soft and the grass is green. Where no one knows the name McCree." It sounded like a fairy tale. But Hannah nodded. "West," she said. She handed him the last of the water. "Drink. We have a long ride." Outside, the sun began to set, painting the canyon in shades of blood and gold. A coyote howled, close and lonely. Hannah took Cole's hand, interlacing her fingers with his. They were starving, hunted and exiled. But as the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Hannah realized she had never felt so safe. Sheriff Miller found the line shack on the fourth day. He did not ride in with a posse thundering behind him. He rode in alone, his horse picking its way carefully through the loose shale of the canyon floor. He had followed a trail that was barely there, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss, the faint impression of a hoof on hardpan. He stopped his horse 50 yards from the shack. The silence of the Badlands was absolute, save for the dry rattle of wind through the scrub brush. He saw the two horses tied near the collapse of the back wall. They looked gaunt, heads hanging low. Sheriff Miller sighed. He shifted his weight in the saddle, feeling the ache in his old joints. He drew his revolver, a heavy peacemaker with worn walnut grips, and rested it on his thigh. "Hello, the house," he called out. His voice echoed off the canyon walls. For a long moment, there was no movement. Then, the door creaked open. Hannah stepped out. She looked like a ghost. Her dress was torn and stained with mud and blood. Her hair hung in matted tangles around her face. but her eyes were clear, and she held a piece of driftwood like a club. Behind her, Cole Hart appeared in the doorway. He was leaning heavily against the frame, his face the color of old parchment. He had a gun in his hand, but the barrel wavered. "Put it down." "Son," the sheriff said calmly, "you look like a strong breeze would knock you over. I do not want to shoot a man who can barely stand." Cole hesitated. He looked at Hannah, then back at the lawman. "We are not going back," Cole rasped. "You do not have a choice," Miller said. "Thomas has the whole town worked up into a lather. If I leave you here, a posse will find you in 2 days, and they will not ask you to put the gun down. They will just burn the shack with you inside." Hannah stepped in front of Cole. "He did not kidnap me." "Sheriff, I went with him. I chose to go." Miller looked at her. He saw the defiance in her posture, so different from the timid woman he had seen buying flour in town. He saw the way she placed her body between the gun and the cowboy. "I believe you, Mrs. McCree," Miller said. "But the law does not work on belief. It works on testimony. You have to come back and tell it to the judge. Or in this case, the town." "We will not get a fair hearing," Cole said. "Thomas owns that town. Thomas is loud," Miller conceded. "But he does not own me. You come back with me, and I give you my word you will get a chance to speak. You stay here, you die of infection or starvation." Cole lowered the gun. He knew the sheriff was right. He could feel the fever creeping back into his blood, the weakness in his legs. He looked at Hannah. She nodded, a small, grim movement. "All right," Cole said. "We will come." The ride back to town was a slow, punishing journey. Cole had to be tied to his saddle to keep from falling. Hannah rode beside him, reaching out every few miles to touch his arm, checking his heat. Sheriff Miller rode ahead, his back straight. He was a man wrestling with his own conscience. He had known Thomas McCree for 10 years. He knew him to be a hard man, a man who cut corners, but kidnapping and attempted murder, that was a different breed of sin. Halfway down the mountain, they stopped to water the horses at a creek. Hannah dismounted and helped Cole down. She wet her handkerchief, the ruined scrap of cloth that had started it all, and wiped his face. "Sheriff," Hannah said, standing up. Miller looked at her. "Yes, ma'am?" "Thomas lied to you. He lied to everyone." Miller took a plug of tobacco from his pocket and bit off a piece. "Men often lie when their pride is stung. Mrs. McCree, it is not just pride," she said. "It is violence. He has beaten me for years. He has threatened to kill anyone who looks at me. And—" She hesitated, glancing at Cole. "There is something else." Miller stopped chewing. "Go on. You remember the homesteader? Mr. Miller? The one who disappeared 3 years ago?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "I remember. He vanished the same week he and Thomas had a dispute over the water rights on the South Creek. Thomas killed him," Hannah said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "He bragged about it once, when he was drunk. He said he put him where the coyotes would not find him, near the deep ravine in the Badlands. He buried him with his own shovel." Miller stared at her. "That is a heavy accusation." "Hannah, it is the truth." Miller looked at Cole. "Did you know this?" "I suspected," Cole said weakly. "He threatened me with the same fate. Said he knew how to make a man disappear." Miller spat into the dirt. He looked back up the trail toward the ravine they had passed miles back. He was silent for a long time. "Let's get moving," he said finally. "We have a long ride." They arrived in town just as the sun was setting on the second day. The sky was a bruised purple, casting long, distorted shadows across the street. News traveled fast. By the time they reached the main drag, people were stepping out of their shops and homes. They lined the boardwalks, silent and staring. It was a gauntlet of shame. Hannah sat tall in her saddle, refusing to look down, though her face burned. She heard the whispers. "Look at her," a woman hissed. "Filthy. Run off with a drifter." A man spat into the dust. "Woman thief. She should be ashamed to show her face." Hannah saw Mrs. Gable turning her back deliberately, pulling her skirts away as the horses passed. She saw the men eyeing Cole with a mixture of disgust and dark anticipation. They saw a dead man walking. The church bell began to toll, a slow, mournful sound that felt like a judgment. Dong, dong, dong. It echoed against the wooden buildings, marking their arrival as a funeral procession for their reputation. Sheriff Miller led them straight to the saloon. It was the only building big enough to hold the crowd that was gathering. He helped Cole down, supporting the wounded man's weight. Inside, the saloon was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. The tables had been pushed back. Thomas McCree sat at a table near the front, his arm in a black silk sling. He looked pale and righteous, holding court with a glass of whiskey in his good hand. When the doors opened and the sheriff brought them in, the room went deadly silent. Thomas stood up. He pointed a shaking finger at Cole. "There he is," Thomas shouted. "The snake who bit the hand that fed him! And there is the wife he corrupted!" Murmurs of anger rippled through the room. Men shifted on their feet, hands drifting toward their belts. "Sit down!" "Thomas," Miller barked. "I will not sit down." Thomas roared. "I want justice. That man tried to kill me in my own home. He stole my wife and dragged her into the hills. He did not steal me." Hannah's voice cut through the noise. It was not a scream. It was a clear, ringing declaration. She stepped into the center of the room. She looked small in her torn dress, her face streaked with dirt, but she held her head high. "I went with him," Hannah said, looking at the crowd. "I went because I chose to." A gasp went through the room. A woman admitting to adultery was unheard of. It was social suicide. "You are confused." "Hannah," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a menacing purr. "The shock, the fear. He has twisted your mind. My mind is clear." "Thomas," she said, "for the first time in 5 years, it is clear." She turned to the townspeople. "You all know Thomas McCree. You know he is a rich man. You know he is a powerful man. But do you know what happens behind the closed doors of his house?" She pulled up the sleeve of her dress. The bruises from where Thomas had grabbed her were dark purple and yellow, ugly marks against her pale skin. "He gave me these," she said, "because I dropped a handkerchief. He has given me others for burning the bread, or for speaking when I should be silent. I have lived in terror of him since the day I arrived." "Lies," Thomas shouted, his face reddening. "She is lying to protect her lover. Yes, he is my lover," Hannah cried out. The room erupted in shouts. Miller fired a shot into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down. "Quiet," the sheriff bellowed. "Let her speak." Hannah looked at Thomas, then at Cole, who was leaning against the bar, watching her with a love that held her up like a pillar. "I loved him," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I loved him because he was kind, because he saw me as a human being, not a piece of property. I know what I did was a sin in the eyes of the church. I know you all think I am a fallen woman. But if loving a man who treats me with gentleness is a sin, then I will carry it, because it was the only time in my life I felt safe." She took a breath. "And I would rather be a sinner with him than a saint in Thomas McCree's hell." Silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. The townspeople looked at the bruises on her arm. They looked at the raw honesty in her face. Doubt began to creep into their eyes. "Mrs." Avery stepped out from the back of the room. She was wearing her black widow's weeds. "I believe her, Mrs." Avery said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "I visited the ranch last winter." "Mrs." Avery said, "I heard shouting. I saw Hannah wearing long sleeves in the summer to hide marks. And I saw the way Thomas looked at her, like he wanted to break her." "You are a bitter widow," Thomas sneered. "You do not know what you are talking about. And there is the matter of the homesteader." A man's voice spoke up from the corner. It was Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper Thomas had bullied. "What about him?" Thomas snapped. "He disappeared mighty convenient." "Thomas, right after you told me you were going to handle him." "This is a conspiracy," Thomas shouted, looking around wildly. "You are all turning against me for a drifter and a whore? That is enough." "Thomas," Sheriff Miller said. Miller stepped forward. He reached into his saddlebag, which he had thrown onto the bar. He pulled out a rusted, broken spade head and a scrap of plaid flannel shirt. He threw them onto the table in front of Thomas. We stopped at the ravine on the way down. Miller said grimly, I found these where the earth had been disturbed. That shirt matches the one Miller, the homesteader, was wearing the day he vanished. And that shovel? It has your brand burned into the handle. Thomas. The room went cold. The accusation of murder hung in the air, far heavier than adultery. Thomas stared at the items. His face went gray. His arrogance crumbled, replaced by the cornered panic of a guilty man. You planted those? Thomas stammered. No, Thomas, Miller said, you were just sloppy. You thought you were untouchable. Thomas looked around the room. He saw the faces of the townspeople hardening against him. He saw the judgment shifting. He realized his control was gone. The fear he had used to rule his wife and his neighbors had evaporated. He looked at Hannah. She was standing next to Cole now. They were together, united against him. It was too much for his pride to bear. No, Thomas whispered. No! He moved with the speed of a striking snake. His good hand snatched the heavy revolver from the sheriff's holster as Miller turned to address the crowd. Thomas! Miller shouted. Thomas swung the gun toward Cole. I will send you both to hell! Cole shoved Hannah behind him. He didn't have a weapon. The sheriff had taken it. He could only use his body. The sheriff lunged at Thomas. The gun went off. The boom was deafening in the confined space. Smoke filled the air. Women screamed. Men dove for cover. Thomas and the sheriff grappled, crashing into the table. The gun fell from Thomas's hand, skittering across the floor. But Thomas didn't go for it. He slumped forward, his eyes wide with shock. He collapsed onto the sawdust floor. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the center of his chest. In the struggle, the gun had turned inward. Thomas McCree lay on his back, gasping for air. Blood bubbled at his lips. He looked up at Hannah, who was staring down at him with horror and pity. You... Thomas wheezed. His hand clawed at the air. You did this? His eyes fixed on Cole. Curse! You... Then his hand dropped. His eyes stared unseeing at the tin ceiling. Thomas McCree was dead. The silence that followed was absolute. The sheriff stood up, brushing sawdust from his knees. He picked up his gun and holstered it. He looked down at the body, then at the crowd. It was an accident, the sheriff said loudly. He drew on an unarmed man. The gun discharged in the struggle. He looked at the men who had been shouting for a hanging just 10 minutes ago. Does anyone see it different? The men looked at the dead tyrant on the floor. They shook their heads. No one saw it different. Sheriff Miller turned to Cole and Hannah. He is dead, Miller said. But this town has a long memory. He looked at the crowd. They were not cheering. They were shocked, and they were confused. They had seen the truth, but they still saw a woman who had broken her vows and a man who had killed, indirectly or not, a pillar of their community. You are free to go, Miller said to Cole. I will not hold you. But you cannot stay here, neither of you. There is no welcome for you in Bitter Creek. I understand, Cole said. He held his side, his face pale but relieved. Take your horses, Miller said, and ride. Do not look back. Hannah and Cole walked out of the saloon. The cool night air hit them, washing away the smell of smoke and death. They walked to the hitching post where their tired horses waited. Before they mounted, Hannah stopped. I need a moment, she said. She walked across the street to the small white church. The door was unlocked. She went inside. It was dark and empty, smelling of beeswax and old hymnals. She walked to the altar and knelt. She did not pray for forgiveness for loving Cole. She knew in her heart that love was not a sin, but she prayed for the weight of the past to be lifted. She prayed for Thomas's soul, twisted and dark as it had been. Forgiveness. She realized, kneeling in the silence, was not about saying what happened was right. It was not about forgetting the bruises or the terror. It was about cutting the rope that tied her to the pain. It was about choosing to walk out of the darkness. She stood up. She felt lighter. The ghost of Hannah McCree, the victim, stayed in the church. The woman who walked out was someone new. Cole was waiting for her. He helped her onto her horse, his hands gentle. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am ready." They rode out of town as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the mountains. They did not look back at the ranch. They did not look back at the grave that would soon be dug for Thomas. They rode west. The journey was hard. They had little food, and the Cole's wound was still healing. But the air grew sweeter with every mile. The land changed from the brown, beaten plains to the green, rising slopes of the high country. They were seeking a valley Cole had heard of, a place where the earth was rich and the water ran clear, a place where no one knew their names. 3 days later, they stopped on a high ridge. Below them, the land fell away into a sprawling green basin. A silver river threaded through it, glittering in the morning sun. Stands of aspen and pine dotted the slopes. It was wild, and it was empty. "It looks like possibility," Hannah whispered. Cole brought his horse alongside hers. He looked better. The color had returned to his face, and the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet peace. "We can build a cabin there," he said, pointing to a sheltered spot near the river bend. "I can raise a barn. We can plant a garden. And a porch," Hannah said. "A porch where we can sit and watch the sun go down without being afraid." Cole looked at her. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid. "I have nothing to offer you but these hands and this heart, Hannah," he said. "That is all I ever wanted," she replied. He leaned across the gap between their horses. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the line shack. It was not the stolen, fearful kiss of the kitchen. It was slow. It was deep. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and pine and survival. It was the seal on a promise that had been written in blood and redeemed in hope. Hannah framed his face with her hands, feeling the rough stubble of his beard, the scar on his jaw that matched the scars on her heart. She looked into his gray eyes and saw her future reflected there. The wind whistled through the tall grass around the horse's legs, carrying the scent of sage and new beginnings. It was a harsh land, an unforgiving land, but it was their land now. "Make it count," she whispered against his lips. "We will," he promised. They turned their horses toward the valley floor. They rode down into the sunlight, side by side, carrying their scars and their grief, but carrying also a stubborn, tender love that had survived the fire. They rode toward a home that would be built not on duty or fear, but on the simple, radical truth that they had chosen each other, and the West, vast and indifferent, watched them go, bearing witness to the only thing that could ever truly tame it, a love that refused to die. Thank you for listening to He's Coming Home Tonight. She cried. The cowboy kissed her harder. Then make it count. I hope this story of Hannah and Cole touched your heart and transported you to the rugged, emotional landscape of the American West. I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Please leave a comment below telling me which country or city you call home. What did you think of the ending? Did Hannah and Cole find the peace they deserved? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of love, survival, and the frontier spirit. Thank you for your time. And until the next ride, keep your powder dry and your heart open.